My name is Evans Harrell. I'm at Georgia Tech. I'll be moderating this session for a change because this talk that you're about to hear by Moon Duchin on graphs, geometry, and gerrymandering is a joint production of the Gathering for Gardner Celebration of Mind and Georgia Tech. To introduce Moon Duchin, I'm going to turn this event over to my colleague, Matt Baker. He's actually the Associate Dean for Magic in the College of Sciences, as some of you may know from having watched him do his wonderful show last night.
Welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Moon Duchin. Moon Duchin is a professor of mathematics at Tufts University and a senior fellow in Tufts Tisch College of Civic Life. She earned her PhD in mathematics from the University of Chicago in 2005, doing research centered on geometric group theory and geometric topology. Since 2016, Dr. Duchin has become deeply involved in studying the mathematics of redistricting. She founded the MGGG Redistricting Lab, which is an interdisciplinary effort that uses geometry, computation, and mathematical techniques such as Markov chains to study electoral redistricting and voting rights. And I thought that maybe MGGG stood for Martin Gardner's Grand Gathering, but it turns out it's Metric Geometry and Gerrymandering Group. So, but it could have been either. Moon Duchin also founded a summer program to train mathematicians to become expert witnesses in legal cases related to gerrymandering. And in 2018, Pennsylvania Governor Tom Wolf enlisted her help to evaluate newly drawn redistricting maps for fairness. Dr. Duchin was also the director and founder of Tufts Interdisciplinary Science, Technology, and Society program. Dr. Duchin is a fellow of the American Mathematical Society and has received many other honors and awards, including a Radcliffe Fellowship and a Guggenheim Fellowship. And so with that, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Moon Duchin.
All right. So really excited to be with you today to talk about my favorite topic, which is gerrymandering, redistricting. Accessible topic, but also one that gets you right up to the frontiers of kind of the democracy battles happening this year as everybody redistricts. I'm going to actually show you what's happening like right now this week around the country using forensics from these mathy ideas. Okay, so here we go. Let's start with the big picture, which is districts in the first place and what they're supposed to be doing for us. So I'll just talk about this very briefly, but why districts? So the idea here, ever since the founding of the US, was that geographical districts would give us our best chance to turn the government of the country into kind of a network of deliberative democracy. The idea was supposed to be that the districts would be small enough chunks, territory that you could really understand, territory where the people all had some similar interests and concerns, and where they could gather to deliberate, right? So the idea was, as the country was already big and of course has gotten much bigger, and instead of putting everything to direct democracy, the idea is to have pieces that capture something about local interests. That's a great idea, and it also has a lot of problems, and we'll like kind of look at some of those as we go. So how do districts work? Well, what happens every 10 years is that the Census Bureau releases new population counts for every state, and they're supposed to enumerate all the people by going door to door and actually sort of laying eyes on or hearing a firsthand description of who they are, you know, how old they are, where they live. Those numbers, Census Day is April 1st, the year ending in 0, so 2020. April 1st, 2020, right after that shutdown, that was Census Day. And then usually that data is released about a year later, but it was substantially more delayed this year because of COVID and other complexities. So we only got that new data out August 12th. New numbers come out, and then we run a little rounding algorithm, and we decide how many members of the House of Representatives go to every state. So, in Massachusetts, we have 9. Georgia has 14. States have different numbers of districts depending on their population share, right? And so we get that apportionment, and then with that apportionment, we have to take the territory of the state and partition it into pieces. So I'm going to set that up as a discrete problem. So here's Iowa. And on the left is Iowa and its counties. And I've drawn like a network or a graph to record those counties and how they are adjacent, their adjacency pattern. And on the right, Iowa's apportionment is 4 congressional districts. So I have to take those and I have to kind of give them 4 different assignments here represented with colors. And voila, I have a districting plan, congressional districting. It's worth pointing out at this point that congressional redistricting isn't the only kind, of course. So around the nation, we have, besides congressional districts, we also have state legislatures. And so there are districts for the state senate and the state house. Many counties have county commission districts. Many cities have city council districts. We have water board districts and school board districts. I mean, we just have kind of a staggering number of lines that have to be drawn and redrawn after every census. So this is a big process, and it's pretty consequential. One of the questions that I want us to ask ourselves for the duration of this talk is this key question. What do we expect districts to do when they convert voter preferences to representation? So as shorthand for that question, I'm going to ask, does 40% of the vote deserve 40% of the seats? Right? This isn't the kind of question that we can answer with math, right? What we deserve, what ought to happen, this is a normative question that we have to debate and think through and decide how we want our democracy to function. But this intuition that a certain vote share should be converted to very close to the equal seat share, this goes by the name proportionality. And most people expect that if nobody was trying to squeeze extra advantage out of the lines, if nobody was trying to gerrymander, in short, to draw the lines for their own advantage, then in a state of nature, 40% of the vote would tend to get 40% of the seat. That's most people's intuition. Okay, so let's spend a little time examining that. And so the first thing I want to point out is just first in cartoon form, later we'll see this in practical form, what might happen when you have 40% of the votes? How much control of the outcomes do you have just by perfect knowledge of the votes and the authority to draw the line? So here's an illustrative example. I'm going to show, so this is some 10 by 10 grids, and I've drawn different partitions on them into, balanced pieces with 10 units each connected. And we'll see how they convert votes to seats. So I put the same orange and pink pattern underneath all 3 of these. And what you can see if you go through and calculate is that the first one gives no seats to the orange team. The middle one gives their proportional outcome of 4 seats. And then if you gerrymander aggressively for Team Orange, you can get up to 6 seats. So that's out of 10 seats here, right? Because these are 10 districts. So we're saying that that team with 40%, that side with 40% orange support, can get anywhere from no representation to 60% of the representation in this stylized example where an omniscient line drawer gets to control the lines completely. Right. So this should kind of set us up to be worried because if indeed you can be pretty sure about where the voters are, then you can potentially really skew the outcome towards yourself. All right, so let's try to ease into the math of working out, right? Okay, I should say, so I posed the normative question, does 40% of the votes deserve 40% of the seats? And now I'm going to slyly shift it to a mathematical question. Please note the shift. Instead of what people deserve, I'm going to talk about what they would tend to get if you followed the rules blindly. This is a different question, but it's important to understand. So right now I'd like to develop the math of what the kind of neutral tendency would be if you just draw the lines according to some basic. So we're going to warm up with a 4 by 4 grid. A moment ago we had a 10 by 10 grid. Let's make it smaller so we can really see what's going on. Okay, so this is the 4 by 4 into 4 problem where I'm taking a 4 by 4 grid and I'm breaking it up into 4 connected pieces of 4 units. In other words, it's like a Tetris decomposition of the 4 by 4. Okay, so look at these for a minute and ask yourself, back of the envelope, quick question. How many ways do you think there are to do this? How many ways to break up a 4x4 grid into Tetris pieces of an order of magnitude? All right, well, here's the answer. This is all of them. There are 117. Okay, so just a couple things to note. One, in this picture, the ones that are just obtained from each other by rotation and reflection are the same color. So you can see there's a 4x4 grid has dihedral symmetry, has 8 symmetries. And so you can see there's some symmetry within the patterns, but 117 is like probably not a number that you've kind of run into in the street before. And what that's kind of a hint to is that this is a problem where the counting doesn't follow any kind of famous patterns. It's a problem with no recursive structure that anyone's been able to identify yet. So if you know the full answer to the 4x4, it doesn't get you anywhere with the 8x8, for instance. Stop and think about that, but that's sad and true. And so it's actually like not so obvious how to be any cleverer when you're looking for successful redistricting plans here. It's not obvious how to be any cleverer than brute force enumeration, looking at all the different labelings for all the nodes and then just sort of sorting down to the ones that are balanced and connected. So this is a bear of a combinatorial problem. And let me sort of proceed through the story and try to tell you a little bit more about how that looks. So the 4x4 into 4 was 117. Here's a table of everything we know. And so that's the 4x4 into 4. That's the 117. And you can see on the rest of this table, like the frontier of ignorance is remarkably close to that. So we know a lot about the 6x6. Oh, actually, I guess we know a little more than my team has done some really cool combinatorics and enumeration, and we filled in a few more of these. I can see that this table is not completely up to date, but I'll give you a link for where all the up-to-date information on this is, and you'll see that, for instance, we still don't know the answer for the 9x9 into 9. That is for all the different values across these columns. And we don't even know the total enumeration of equal size for the 10x10. Okay, and that's not for lack of trying. You can run a high-performance computer for a month and still not get the answer, with the cleverest known algorithm to do this, and still not get the answer. Okay, so the counting problem is hard. And notice, it's not hard because these numbers are so terribly big. They're not so big for a computer. But to get to this number, you have to, as I was saying a moment ago, you have to kind of brute force check a much bigger number of possibilities. So the problem just suffers from combinatorial explosion, and it gets out of reach really fast. Now let me take a slide or two to comment on a really important, really interesting, and kind of underappreciated puzzle. It's not just about how many votes, it's about where the votes are. So there's some geometry in this problem, which is, I as a geometer was drawn to it partially for this reason. All right, so let's examine spatiality. So this time I'm showing you a 6x6 grid. And on the 6x6 grid, I have placed 12 club suit icons. And so that's 12 out of 36. That's a third of the votes we imagine went to the club's party. Okay. But what I've done in these pictures is I've varied how clustered those voters are. Are they like in the green grid? Are they completely clustered in one tight cluster? Or like in the red grid, 2 clusters? Or are they like in the blue grid, really spread out? Or something in between, like in the orange grid? So these are 4 different kind of cartoon representations of possible demographic arrangements. You could have sort of everybody who likes clubs packed into one city, or like 2 cities like in the red, or they could be really dispersed, or somewhere in between. What I've written underneath the color bar on each one is a little statistic that's trying to capture how clustered the arrangement is. So there are 60 neighboring pairs of squares in a 6x6 grid. And what I've told you is, in how many cases do you have the neighbors that have the same pattern versus different? So for instance, in the red grid, 50 times when you look at neighboring pairs, it's either club next to club or blank next to blank. And only 10 times is it a club next to a blank. Is that clear? That's what I mean by 50 same, 10 different. Right? As you can think of this as like a kind of, how likely am I to be like my neighbor, which is a sort of segregation or clustering score for these voters. So, stop again and interrogate your intuition and ask yourself, all 4 configurations have the same number of clubs votes. It's a third of the votes. What do we think is going to happen when we draw all possible districting plans? Remember, we can do that because the 6 by 6 into 6 was a completely solved, completely enumerated problem. I can do more than enumerate. I can actually store all the plans, and so I can ask, like, for all the possible ways of cutting this up, how might the clubs do? All right, so hopefully you have a guess of which one is going to be the best outcome for clubs. And here's what happens. So here I'm dividing it into 6 districts, 6 by 6 into 6 districts. And so the proportional share for clubs, since they have a third of the votes, would be a third of the 6 districts. So 2 seats would be the proportional outcome for clubs, right? And what you can see is that, man, spatiality matters. Being really dispersed, like in the blue grid, is terrible. You're just never going to get your proportional share of the seats. You're going to tend to get 0, half. I gave half a seat if a district was split 3 and 3. There's a tiny little bar there at 1.5, and you can't get up to 2. And then what you can see is the clustered configurations are a whole lot more generous, average, to the club suit. But interestingly, orange busts a little bit past proportionality and gives you a slightly super proportional expectation. And I can tell you that my team was able to find a clever way to search exhaustively all the possible configurations. Orange is actually the best of all possible ways to arrange 12. And I find it kind of interesting. It's neither fully clustered nor fully dispersed. It's in this kind of intricate frontier arrangement that turns out to be the best of all. All right, so let's shift for a second to the real world. So Iowa, again, was 99 counties. Iowa's unusual in that it actually, by statute, has a requirement that you have to make congressional districts out of whole counties. That's great for mathematicians who want to do complete enumeration, because instead of thousands of units, there are only 99. But the bad news is, and it's super depressing, even 99 units into 4 districts, we still can't do completely. So we're not quite at Iowa levels of sophistication, let alone Pennsylvania. So here's Pennsylvania's dual graph. If you choose to keep precincts whole. So there's over 9,000 precincts in Pennsylvania, and there were 18 districts in the last cycle. They're down to 17 districts in this cycle. That's a whole lot of ways to do it. That's if you keep precincts whole, as I said. If you go down to itty-bitty census blocks, which most states do, there's actually over 400,000 of those that you have to partition into now 17 congressional districts, 50 state senate districts, and 160 state house. Okay, so that's huge. Okay, so that's going to be impossible. So what are we going to do? We can't enumerate them all, just absolutely not. We're talking like we will all be long gone by the time that the problem even gets warmed up on a computer. And so what we can do instead of trying to enumerate them all is to try to sample some. So here are 2 different little videos I'll run of processes that create random partitions. So I started out here with a grid that was color-coded with vertical stripes. We imagine that's some initial districting plan. And then on the left, I'm changing the assignment of just 1 node at a time to create a new plan. And on the right, I'm doing something kind of bigger and bolder and wilder. As these run, you can see that they are creating some variety. But the thing on the left, the process on the left, is having trouble forgetting that it started with vertical stripes. Having trouble really escaping from the memory of its initial position. Whereas on the right, after just a few steps, it's obliterated the memory of how it began. And you'll notice that the districts on the right are also like fatter, they're plumper, they don't have long skinny necks. Whereas the ones on the left have kind of retained some of their skinniness. So the left chain is in a family you might call flip because it flips 1 node at a time. These are really inspired by some very successful sampling methods in physics. But they don't work that well for connected partitions. They just have a lot of trouble moving around. And so the thing on the right nicknamed RECOM, is a random process called recombination that we developed and implemented in my research group. And it's doing a nice job of producing districts that look like you might actually want to adopt them for kind of dividing up a state. How's it doing it? I'm not going to dwell on this, but I just want to sort of point you to the math. Under the hood, it's using something called spanning trees. So you take 2 districts at a time, you combine them. You draw a tree that touches all of the nodes. You cut that tree in a position that leaves 2 balanced pieces, and voila, those are your 2 new districts. And the nice thing about that is it tends to produce districts with a lot of spanning trees. If you think about it by construction, it tends to produce districts that could have had a spanning tree representation in many ways. And the bottom figure is supposed to try to convince you that the more spanning trees you have, the plumper your districts, the shorter your cut set, the kind of nicer your partition. So this is a process that's going to tend to produce districts that are more what we call in redistricting compact, meaning fat and nicely shaped, lots of interior, no wild boundaries. Okay, so let's see how this looks on a state. Here's Pennsylvania, and here's a chain run that's using 2 districts at a time and splitting them in a new way with a spanning tree. It can be done pretty efficiently. Okay, so what's the game here? We're not able to build all the ways of redistricting, but we can make a proverbial schmillion of them by this kind of technique. And if we have some idea that we've converged to a distribution that we understand, then we can call that a representative sample according to our distribution. Okay, and so that's where a lot of the math research effort has been, trying to figure out how long do you have to run this before the sample of plans that you can collect is representative of the whole universe of valid plans. And there's lots of interesting stuff to say. Please feel free to ask me about that if you want. Okay, so let's revisit this picture and kind of put a wrinkle on it in a new way. So here again, we had the 4 different spatial arrangements of clubs voters, and we asked how many votes would they tend to get, how many seats rather would they tend to get if we did if we blindly chose a partition, and this was our answer. But now we can shift to a slightly different question. We can say, well, maybe I don't want to actually weight all districting plans equally. Maybe I want a process that tends to upweight the nice-looking compact plans, like the process we just saw. And if you do that, the answer will change. In particular, here's the new answer. So that top row is the representation that each group secured if you sample from the possible districting plans uniformly at random. And on the bottom, that's what you'd get from the random recombination process that you just saw, which upweights the more compact or nicely shaped plans. I think this is really interesting. If you look, the one that looks the most different is the red, and this makes sense. Take a look at that red grid. If you think about having a nice fat district, it's going to tend to give you one club's district in the southwest, another club's district in the northeast, and that's it. So if you're not allowing for winding shapes, you should really expect to get 2 districts won by the clubs out of that red grid, and that's exactly what happens once you require that the districts be fat. I hope this makes some sense. But it points in the direction of something really sophisticated, which is what's typical depends on kind of how you weight your sample, right? And that's another topic that's of tons of interest to people right now who want to think about redistricting. Okay, but long and short of it is, the most reasonable thing to do, the wisdom around this has crystallized in the direction that the most reasonable thing to do is to prefer compact plans because that's actually in the rules in most places. And then do other basic things, balance the population, make sure your districts are connected, try to keep counties whole. Those are some of the basics. Okay, there's just tons of open questions about the math. I'm going to just tour through them blazingly fast. So I'll make these slides available so you can look at them later and feel free to reach out and ask me about them if you want. I just want to give you a flavor for how much is not known, which is a lot. We don't have an enumeration or even, a kind of order of growth for the n by n into k problem, n by n grid into k districts. We don't know much about the complexity of sampling from balanced partitions. There are some really cool theorems, both positive and negative results about sampling. There's a theorem by some of my MGGG collaborators, Daryl DeFord and Justin Solomon, together with Lorenzo Knight. They have a beautiful theorem that says it's really hard to sample uniformly. So not only are uniform samples probably not the best, they're also hard to get. But there's lots still to do in the direction of complexity. Connectivity. Can we've seen these recombination moves that take you from one plan to another. Can you transit all balanced connected partitions with these moves? That's actually still an open question, even on grids. That spanning tree step required that you draw a spanning tree and then cut it at an edge that leaves two balanced halves. And the question is, it's clear that not every tree can be cut in a balanced way. What proportion of trees can? It's a great question, a really fun question. Isospanometric problem. So I was talking before about how like fat districts have a lot of spanning trees. Say something precise about which districts have the most spanning trees, even on a grid. That's an open problem. Which subgraphs have the most spanning trees? And then a precise relationship between the spanning tree count and the size of the cut set. Lots of great open questions. Okay. Oh, yes, and I wanted to mention, there's really beautiful new work in this direction. Actually, Jen Clellan and some of her students have a great paper about this. Chris Tapp has something brand new on the archive, and so do Ariel Percasia and Jamie Tucker-Foltz. So there's actually lots of mathematicians and theoretical computer scientists who've been excited by these kinds of questions and are working on them. Okay. All right, but now I want to shift gears and let's talk about what's actually happening around right now. So here we are, it's 2021. We got the census data, we got it late, and now comes the scrum, right? So now everybody's kind of redrawing the lines. And interestingly, intriguingly, in the last 10 years, we had a great number of states kind of change the rules about who does the process and how. So Colorado, Ohio, Michigan, Missouri, Utah, Virginia, and Wisconsin all have new commissions of one kind or another, whether set up by one branch of government, whether totally independent of government, whether bipartisan. They really vary a lot in their structure. And I've been doing a lot of work with many of these commissions and redistricting bodies to try to help them figure out kind of how they're doing in this giant wilderness of possibility. So what I want to do next is tour you through some recom-enabled views of the plans that are being proposed by commissions and by legislatures as we speak. So literally, this is everything I'm about to show you is happening within the last 2 weeks. Like I said, timely talk. All right, look at Michigan. Before I narrate this slide, I will just sort of recap the situation there. Michigan is one of the states that set up a fully empowered citizens commission. So what they do is they choose through a long and complicated process a number of commissioners who aren't elected officials, have no direct connection to elected officials or to political parties, and they sat them on the MICRC, the Michigan Independent Citizens Redistricting. Over the span of many months, they got educated about redistricting, they learned some software, they hired some consultants, and they started drawing lines. And just something like about 2 weeks ago, they released their first batch of draft plans. So they codenamed those with tree names. So their congressional plans were nicknamed Apple, Birch, Juniper, and Maple. And what I want to show you is just some basic stats about how their plans perform on some quantitative measures that might be of interest to people. And what I'm going to do each time is compare it to 100,000 random plans collected by a recombination. Okay, so this is commission plans versus 100,000 neutral alternatives, giant air quotes. Remember, the plans a computer can draw only do what they're told to do. The algorithm only does what it's told. And so the plans drawn by the computer don't know about like communities of interest unless you somehow tell it, right? And so these plans, it's important to specify, were drawn only population balanced, connected, compact because of how recom upweights compactness, and with a priority on county integrity. Okay, and here's what we get. So across these elections in 2016 and 2018, what you ask yourself is the question, if people voted like they did, so let's look at Pres 16, if people voted like they did for Clinton versus Trump, how many seats would have had a Democratic plurality? In other words, how many of the 13 districts in this plan would have had more Clinton votes than Trump? And you can see the 50-50 line is marked, half of 13 is 6.5, so that's marked there with a gray line. And the proportionality for that election, in other words, that vote share, is marked with the blue line. So you can see Michigan is really a tight state. It's very close to 50-50. In all 5 of the elections that you see here, the vote, that blue line isn't too far from 50-50. But now the kind of violin plot is showing you the 100,000 random plans. And so you can see that as the sea level of voting preferences rises and falls a little, that kind of accordion-shaped set of outcomes from the random plans rises and falls a lot. So you see this like exaggerated response to the changing preferences of the electorate. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, and now the colored dots are the commission plans themselves. So you can see, what do you see when you look at this? What I see is that those commission plans are doing a really great job of tracking proportionality. They could go higher in Gov 18, they could go lower in Pres 16 and still be in line with like random blind plans, but they don't. They hew really closely to that proportionality line, perhaps by design. Okay, let's show a couple more statistics from these plans. So here's one, and here's something that I think is kind of nice. In gray is my 100,000 recom plan. In blue is over 100 plans submitted by the public. So actually, the Michigan Department of State brought in our lab to collect public commentary in Michigan. And so we set up a website where the public could submit districting plans of their own. And we got over 100 congressional plans from the public that followed the basic criteria closely enough to be considered here. And so you can see we instructed our algorithm not to split counties, and so the gray stuff is all the way down here at the bottom in terms of county splits. And the public sometimes did as well, and the number of split counties from the public plans is much more. And the commission plans are there. The red line is hiding behind the others, but Maple, Juniper, and Birch all split 13 counties, while Apple split 17. This gives you a nice way to compare the commission's work on this principle to like a mercilessly, efficient algorithm on one hand, and to attempts of the broader public on the other, and to each other. So you're able to do all of that with a forensic. Okay, next. Here's an interesting one. Michigan has a significant African American population, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is still law of the land, requires that opportunity to elect candidates of choice be provided to minorities of a significant size. And that certainly applies to Black voters in Michigan. And so what are we seeing in this plot? Now the columns are districts, and we're seeing, like on the left, this is the 100,000 random plans. What's the Black voting age percentage in the district with the highest Black population? That's the box and whiskers. And what is it in the commission plan? And then on the right in blue, that's the citizen plan. And so this gives you kind of a nice look inside to see what's happening. More than half of the computer plans had a majority Black district, and the commission plans never did. Right? That's how to read this. On the other hand, the second district only cracks 40%, a very small, less than 1% of the time, if you draw race blinds. On the other hand, all 4 commission plans crack 40% in the second. In the district with the second highest Black voting age percentage. Importantly, this isn't enough to know for sure. The Voting Rights Act is a really complicated law. This isn't enough information to really know for sure how fully VRA compliance has been secured, but it gives you some kind of forensic that shows you something about how the commission has handled this particular demographic. Happy to take questions about this. Here's one that I think is really interesting. So if I go back a couple slides and you remember what we were looking at with the kind of seats one, remember I remarked that they did an incredibly good job getting close to proportionality. Now stop and think about this for a second. How can I get really close to proportionality in 13 districts? How can I get really close to proportionality if the state is pretty close to even? Well, the one thing I could do is like really lock down a lot of the districts, have like 5 or 6 districts always Republican, 5 or 6 districts always Democratic, and just a few that swing. It's going to be one way of being close to proportional. And what this is telling us is, that's kind of exactly what they did. So a swing district is one that is sometimes won by one party and sometimes won by the other. It's not always red or always blue. It's sometimes red and sometimes blue. And what you can see is that relative to either the citizens or the computer, the commission plans just don't have that many districts that swing. So they have a lot of districts that are safe red or safe blue. Okay, and so completes my very brief statistical tour of Michigan. Just trying to give you a sense, before these ensemble methods came along for sampling districting plans, people were usually just kind of trying to understand plans compared to each other and not to a wider universe of alternatives. And here, what I like about this way of looking at the forensics is you're giving not one but 2 wider universes of alternatives, one that comes from a computer with specific instructions, and the other that comes from members of the public. And it lets you sort of put stats in the context of possibilities. Okay, much more briefly, I want to show you a few other states and kind of give you a sense of what's happening right now. Virginia's got a commission that at the last minute, the rules were changed just before it was kind of approved as a constitutional amendment. Instead of being fully independent, it now contains both citizens approved by the 2 parties and legislators from the 2 parties. So it's now a bipartisan commission with Democrats and Republicans who, in some instances, are having trouble agreeing. So deep was the extent of their trouble agreeing that they hired 2 map makers. One, the Democrats hired a map maker, and the Republicans hired a different map maker. Now let's look at these plans. So you can see A and B were the 2 partisan map makers, and then C1A and C1B were like kind of attempts to use those partisan map makers' ideas to start coming towards consensus. And so look at these pictures. They're the same kinds of pictures I was showing you before. I grayed out the 2020 election because this is only election day vote data in here, and in 2020, a lot of people didn't vote on election day, so it's a little bit less informative. So what do you see? You see that the ones with the most Democratic advantage consistently across this whole data set are B5 and C1B, and the ones with the most Republican advantage consistently across this whole data set are A5 and C1A. And if you just guessed which party was which, you got it right. And so this forensic has correctly picked out the party IDs of the line draw. Okay, so that's what's happening in Virginia. What's happening in Utah? So in Utah, there's a brand new commission, and its job is to, this week, due this Friday, produce plans and hand them to the legislature to be considered for adoption. That's the work that's happening right now in the Utah Commission. And I'll just show you one snapshot from it that I think is real. Actually, let me go back and do one of the questions where I ask you to guess how you think something's going to turn out before we get to it. Unlike Michigan and Virginia, which are very close to 50-50 states, Utah is not. It's quite tilted. And Democrats in a statewide election tend to only get 30%, just like 30 to 70, that maybe 30 or maybe up to like 33 or 35, not a terribly lot more than that. Okay, so that's about a third. So a quarter to a third. So if Democrats are getting a quarter to a third of the vote, what do we think they're going to get in terms of seat share? And now remember, we have 2 separable questions. What should they get and what will they tend to get? Right? Those are not the same thing unless we adjust the system to make it behave the way we want it to behave. But just from raw districting, what do we think is going to happen? And so here's the answer, and it's brutal. So the gray line is 50-50. This is the state house in Utah, which has 75 seats. So the gray line all the way up there at the top is 50-50. The blue bars, as usual, are the proportionality. And so you can see it's sometimes above and sometimes below 25 out of 75, i.e. it's about a third of the support. And those accordions are the blind plans. So they're all the way down at sometimes 10 and fewer seats, which means that on average, something like a third of the vote is going to something like a sixth of the seats. Like just blind redistricting, and this is really important, especially as a function of how dispersed a population is or how concentrated or concentrated in what way. Districts can be enormously punishing to any numerical minority. It's true here in Utah for Democrats. In my home state of Massachusetts, the flip side is equally, actually even more true for Republicans in Massachusetts. It's exceedingly hard to get any representation. And this picture is showing you, interestingly, the mandate for the Utah Commission was to draw with no partisan data, draw partisan blind. And this picture is like big thumbs up, Utah Commission, you did it. In other words, at least your partisan properties are exactly as though you didn't take partisan information into it. Right? So the picture's not, it's not very proportional, but it confirms that these plans have just the partisan measurements that they would if you didn't look at partisan data. Sense, I hope. Okay, and last state, Wisconsin. So Wisconsin's one of the nation's exceedingly few split control states. So it's a state where Republicans control the legislature, and there's a Democrat in the governor's mansion. Governor Evers is a Democrat. So in anticipation of contentious redistricting, the governor created a People's Maps Commission, which is full of citizens, once again, not lawmakers, but citizens. In this case, citizens who, well, I don't mean to imply that lawmakers aren't citizens. But in this case, the chair of the commission is an emergency room doctor. These are kind of Wisconsinites from all walks of life and all around the state who may not have had any real exposure to redistricting arcana before. So what did they do? Oh, and I've been doing some data support work with them to try to explain my relationship to each of these groups. I've been doing some data support for the People's Maps Commission for the last few months. And so here's a comparison that I'll show you two different ways of so the commission released its second round of draft plans. So C2, C3, and C4 are plans from the People's Commission. And then 2 days ago or so, the legislature dropped their new plans. So SB 622 is Senate Bill 622, newly passed by the Republican-controlled legislature. Take a look at the plot, and you see Wisconsin's a closed state. The accordions rise and fall. The maps made by all the different people rise and fall. And consistently at the bottom of the picture, in other words, consistently most favorable to Republicans, is the map made by the legislature. I'm going to show you the same picture with a different view just so you can put it in context. There's 8 seats, and somehow the map made by the legislature manages to come out the most Republican favoring of anything in the batch, like typically with a 1 to 2 seat, sometimes even a little more than 2 seat buffer from the vote share to the actual seat share. Okay. And that's what I've got for you. So what I hope to have done is ease in with some math that says, like, there's some really basic fun combinatorics here. We can't completely enumerate, so we have to sample. There are lots of different ways you can build a random sample. You should think about coming up with a distribution on plans that's going to end up kind of supported on the kind of plans that are plausible in the redistricting application. So not just any plan, not something long and snaky and wild, but you should try to choose plans that would like pass the eyeball test and other kinds of basic tests of validity and plausibility. I briefly outlined a method for doing that, a recombination method for sampling plans like that. And then I'm taking you right up to the minute of what's happening around the country and showing you that these sampling methods give us a way to take plans and compare them not only to each other, not only to plans from the public, which we could have done before, but also to plans made just according to an algorithm that is given certain priorities. If we want to understand the trade-offs between those priorities, we can do that in the context of the algorithm. We can dial up the importance given to one rather than another and see how the kind of ensemble moves here. I'll go back here so while I'm talking. We can say, what if I make county preservation much more important? Does that move the baseline, right? It gives us a way for the first time in, nearly 100 years of the courts in the US wrangling with how they're going to adjudicate disputes about what's fair. Ever since at least the 30s and 40s, the 1930s and 40s, the court's been saying, what's the baseline? What would happen if you weren't trying to get one kind of outcome or another? A remarkable thing has happened in just the last few years, which is that the press, the public, and even the courts have really kind of latched onto this method as a kind of breakthrough in being able to understand what it looks like not to gerrymander. All right. So what's the state of our democracy, all in all? I would say we need a little tender love and care right now for our kind of ailing democracy, which is under a lot of different pressure of a lot of different kinds in this remarkable historical moment. What's exciting to me is that mathematicians, we have a lot of social authority, perhaps even unearned authority, as being objective scientists. And here, I think we should live up to that and leverage that and take advantage to sort of act as honest brokers in redistricting and try to help people understand what are the neutral consequences of this set of rules, that set of rules, how best should we set the rules, and how should we govern ourselves. So for now, we're only in a position to measure how well plans comport with a bunch of rules. It's the job of the broader society keep deliberating, right? And the spirit of districts in the first place, they were to promote deliberative democracy. We should keep debating the rules and trying to refine our systems to better live up to them. So I'll stop there. Thank you. So I see in the Q&A, Charles Weaver asked, how do you get the distribution of legislators to match the proportion of votes? Okay, great. So Charles's question amounts to, what if you take proportionality to be your goal? And so I think maybe it was clear from my discussion of Michigan, and I know it's the case in Wisconsin, that those commissions took proportionality as a goal. I know that because the People's Map Commission in Wisconsin actually did something I think is extremely healthy for a democracy, which is they took their criteria, they debated them, they published them, and they released them with a press release. And in their criteria, they said, if we can do so without sacrificing county integrity and communities of interest and all of our higher ranked priorities, among the things that equally well satisfy the basic principles, we will seek something that's the most proportional. Ohio's Constitution actually says the same thing. It says, if it can be done without breaking any of the other rules, you should strive to have the seats in proportion to the votes. So the first way to get proportionality is to state it as a goal. I know that sounds trivial, but it's really fundamental because notice that's exactly what the Utah Commission didn't do. They stated as a goal to behave as though partisan blind. And so, right, your goals matter. And, well, once you've stated proportionality as a goal, you could certainly kind of tailor your districting plan to promote it. You can look at a suite of recent elections the way I did in the plots that I showed you, and you can say, okay, how about a plan that would have performed proportionally over the voting patterns of the last decade? That's certainly a thing you can do. Well, what you'll find is that that's easier to do in some places than others. Like good luck in Utah filling that chasm between the blind outcomes and the proportional outcomes. There's a mile apart. In Massachusetts, I mentioned that's also pretty brutal. I actually have a published paper on this together with some former students where we show that the way people voted in Massachusetts between 2000 and 2010, you couldn't have drawn a Republican district at all. There was, we actually, it's the rare time you can prove something in redistricting world. We proved it was impossible to draw a district that would get even one Republican seat out of 9, even though Republicans have 1/3 of the vote support. So you couldn't get 1/9 of the seats even with 1/3 of the votes just because they're too uniform. Remember my spatiality slide. When you're really uniform, you're out of luck. So if you want proportionality in a place like Wisconsin, you can get it with districts. If you want proportionality in a place like Massachusetts, you better change your election system. And so there is election reform on the table to look at systems that are more proportional structurally. Most of the rest of the world uses something called party list voting to get to a proportional outcome like de jure by design. But there are other things you can do like ranked choice voting, something called single transferable vote, which gets you proportionality just as a function of the way it lets votes coalesce. So these are live debates, and these are the important debates to be having around the country. If proportionality is something you want, maybe you should change your system. Joe Smith asks, would it perhaps be more favorable to purposefully gerrymander competitive districts in order to maximize politicians' accountability? Yeah, so you can select for anything, right? You can select for competitiveness, you can select for party advantage, you can come up with a notion of what it would mean to satisfy the Voting Rights Act and select for that, and maximize opportunity for minority voters. You can do all kinds of things. And the question is really, if we have to fight the system, the structure, so much to get desirable outcomes, do we come to a tipping point where we want to change? That's the question that's on my mind these days. But yeah, it's a good question. So yes, you can, I should mention though, Joe, you can certainly, sort of heuristically improve. You name a score, you can climb a hill towards improving that score. But something you can't do, and I should have said this long ago, people used to think as soon as you bring computers into redistricting, you're in the optimization world. Now, it was the dream in the 1960s of a whole bunch of different researchers. Bring in computers, program them well, then write down what you're looking for, if you have some sort of objective function, and just hit go. And the computer will find the best plan. Presto, bingo, we've redistricted. Today we realize that this is out of reach. On a real full-scale redistricting problem, there is no way to get to global optimization, to get to provable global optimization. But that's okay, you can still get better things and then debate among them. So I think the problem from that point of view is deciding exactly what it is, deciding as a group what exactly it is that you're trying to improve and how far you're willing to sacrifice the other basic kind of criteria to get there. Barry said proportion of what? Democratic, Republican, minority, etc. It's a great question. Great question. It's really proportion of anything. Like the math question here is just, this is why I was using club suits, right? If you have marked voters, can you get up to the proportion of a marking? That's just sort of a neutral way of stating it. In the practical problem, yeah, people think about proportionality along party lines. They certainly think about whether it's possible for third parties to get elected. I mean, the way U.S. politics works today, third parties can very frequently get, a few percent of the vote, but it's very hard for them to get all the way to representation because of the plurality system. I think I was reading the other day that not since the Dixiecrats that any third party got even one electoral vote in the U.S. So if you think of like Perot, Ross Perot got lots of support and no electoral votes. You can apply proportionality reasoning to anything. I'll mention that I'm very interested in the civil rights perspective here. And districts were kind of an important device of the Voting Rights Act for securing better representation, initially for African Americans in the South, and later for a much expanded set of different kinds of minorities. So Latino voters, Asian voters, language minorities are now covered since the late 70s. They are now covered by the Voting Rights Act. There, the spatiality is also really important. Districts might have been a great device for representation for Black voters in the South at a time of extreme segregation, because when you're very clustered, it's possible to get better representational outcomes. But they don't work as well for dispersed minorities. So recently, for instance, our lab was looking at Lowell, Massachusetts, where Asian and Latino voters sued the city, change its system, and get better representation. And when we studied it, we warned them, like, warning, warning, districts may not do what you want, because in this case, the Asian and Latino minorities were a little bit too spread out in the city, and we were worried it would be very hard to capture them kind of opportunity with districts. So I think it's really a live question. What portion of what? It could be proportion of anti-pipeline voters in, the Dakotas, proportion of anything. The question is just sort of how much can you bend districts to get you to proportionality when that's not their neutral tendency? Question that I've been highlighting today. Oh, Joshua Bishop plugged Jordan Ellenberg's new book, Shape, which I have sitting on my desk and am dying to read. I'm very excited about that, and I want to share the plug. Actually, my lab also has an edited volume coming out any day on redistricting called Political Geometry, so stay tuned for that. We'll have it available online before it's on shelves. So Red Dupree asked, did you say at the end that Michigan was okay? This is a great question. So you do all this stuff, you do all this work, you do all these forensics, and then like, what's the determination at the end of the day? What's the value of it? How does it help? At best, I hope it'll do two things. It'll help these commissions decide among their plans, and it'll show them when they have to go back to the drawing board and when they should actually look to citizen submissions to get ideas. Also, sometimes our ensembles will find a plan with some interesting properties, and a commission will say, hey, you found a plan with 4 swing districts, can we see it? And so the idea is that public plans and computer-made plans, certainly the computer-made plans should never just be plucked out and adopted, because there's a lot they don't know about what's important holistically about redistricting in a particular place, but they can give you good ideas. So did we say in the end that Michigan was okay? I try to hang back from that kind of conclusion, but we gave them information with which to make principled decisions among their plans and about whether they had to expand their selection options. And so I think that's a pretty hopeful note to end on.